Hello and welcome to this video in which I tell 3 short, soft horror stories. If you like this, then give it a like and leave a comment if you want more of these videos. The mirror. Sophie had bought the old mirror for a small price at the flea market. It was large, with an ornate gold rim, and it fit perfectly in her bedroom. Soon, however, she began to notice something strange. Every morning, when she looked at herself in it, her reflection seemed slightly different than the day before. Sometimes a shadow that was wrong, sometimes a vague movement that she herself did not make. One night, as she got out of bed to get water, she saw it again, a flash of movement in the mirror. Sophie turned around, but the room was silent. She walked over to the mirror and looked into it. Her own reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection was smiling. Sophie felt the coldness rush through her. She had not smiled. Before she could look away, her reflection suddenly reached forward and grabbed her wrist. Sophie wanted to scream, but no sound came from her throat. With one jerk, she was pulled into the mirror, and the room was filled with an icy silence. The next morning, there was a woman standing in front of the mirror who looked exactly like Sophie. She was smiling, but it wasn't Sophie. The last passenger. The train station was nearly empty that night, the final train bound for the outskirts of town. Claire hurried to the platform, the cold wind biting at her skin as she wrapped her coat tighter. The old station clock struck midnight, and the train screeched to a halt in front of her, its doors hissing open. She stepped inside, expecting to see a handful of late-night travelers. But the car was empty. Claire hesitated, but with nowhere else to go, she took a seat. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud, and the train lurched forward. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long shadows in the dimly lit car. As she settled in, she felt the unnerving sensation of being watched. She glanced around, but there was no one else, just the empty seats stretching before her. The train rattled through the dark tunnels, and Claire closed her eyes, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. Minutes passed in silence, save for the rhythmic clattering of the wheels. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A man. He sat in the back of the car, staring directly at her. Her heart raced. She was sure the car had been empty. She had checked. The man was still, too still, his face obscured by the shadows. Claire quickly averted her eyes, pretending not to notice him, but her mind raced with questions. How had he gotten there? Had she somehow missed him? The train screeched to a halt at the next station. She stood, ready to get off, but the doors stayed shut. Panic gnawed at her. The train wasn't stopping. Her eyes darted to the back of the car. The man was closer now. He had moved without a sound. Claire's breath hitched. His eyes were locked on hers, wide and unblinking. His mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. The train continued to speed through the dark. Suddenly, the lights flickered off, plunging the car into darkness. When they blinked back on, the man was standing right in front of her, his face inches from hers. His eyes were hollow, empty voids where pupils should have been. Claire screamed, backing away, but the train jolted violently, sending her crashing to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering, and turned to find him gone. The car was empty again. The train slowed as it approached the last station. Shaking, Claire rushed to the doors, desperate to escape. They opened with a hiss, and she bolted onto the platform, her legs weak beneath her. As she glanced back at the train, she saw him, still standing in the car, his eyes following her. The doors closed, and the train disappeared into the night. The shadow in the window. Lucy moved into her new apartment, excited to start fresh. It was a small, cozy place with just enough space for her and her things. The only downside was the large, cracked window in the living room, which faced an alleyway between 2 buildings. But she shrugged it off, figuring she could fix it eventually. On the first night, as she was getting ready for bed, she felt an odd sensation, like she was being watched. She glanced at the window but saw nothing. Just the dark alley, lit dimly by a flickering streetlight. The next night, the feeling returned. Stronger this time. Lucy turned off the lights in her living room, and there it was, something standing in the alley. A figure, tall and thin, just out of the streetlight's reach, staring up at her window. She froze. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. It just watched. The following nights were the same. Every evening, just after dusk, the figure would appear, standing silently in the alley, always looking up at her window. Lucy told herself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by something else. But deep down, she knew better. On the fifth night, after hours of lying awake, she couldn't take it anymore. She marched to the window and yanked it open, shouting into the alley, "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stared. Frustrated, she slammed the window shut and drew the curtains, determined to ignore it. But when she turned around, she saw it. Inside her apartment, standing in the corner, watching her. She never heard it come in.